That's a maker.
One of the things that made the Fremen such a compelling culture in Frank Herbert's original series was the juxtaposed nature of their views on love and violence. The Fremen were a deeply religious, spiritual, and poetic people with a rich tradition of oral history. Yet, their centuries of oppression have turned them into a people for whom violence became the first line of defense, and as you might know, violence only begets violence. It creates a vicious cycle where both sides keep fighting until one or both of them don't exist anymore, and that's the basic premise of the two Dune comics we're about to explore today. In 2025, Boom Studios released the Edge of the Crysknife series, which takes us to Arrakis in the decades leading up to the events of Dune. In this video, we'll be taking a deep dive into the series, as well as its protagonist, who unknowingly ends up pushing her people further into oppression. Spoiler warning if you haven't read them already, because they're really good, and we're about to discuss just how a Fremen warrior ended up putting Vladimir Harkonnen in charge of Arrakis. Before we get into this explanation, we do have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. It's a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin.
What is your name?
Shadout, mate.
Shadout Mapes, House Atreides, and the Fremen. Dune lore set out by Frank Herbert. Dune, Edge of the Crysknife, is set at least 3 to 4 decades before the main Dune series, and it follows the story of one of Dune's more standout minor characters, Shadout Mapes. Technically, her name is just Mapes because Shadout is a Fremen title associated with housekeeping. It means well dipper, and in a society that's located on a desert planet, that title holds a lot of meaning. Collecting water is one of the primary Fremen pursuits of life, and it's as dangerous and life-threatening as trying to ride a sandworm. The Fremen have developed intricate water retention technology to recycle their own bodily fluids because that's how low the supply of water is on Arrakis. A well dipper, a person who delivers water to a settlement, is therefore one of the most honored members of society and held in high regard. In fact, Mapes was already at the Imperial Palace in Arrakis when the Atreides family arrived to take custody of it, hinting that she'd served the Harkonnens as head of their household before them. The reason Mapes is such an important figure in Dune lore is her involvement in getting the ball rolling with regards to the prophecy of the Mahdi. Most Fremen take Paul and Jessica's arrival on Arrakis as a sign that the Lisan al-Gaib, or the voice of the outer world, the leader who would lead them out of oppression, had finally shown himself. The Messiah was said to come from a world different to Dune, and his mother would be a Bene Gesserit sister. That's the belief Fremen hold on to for untold decades. The Missionaria Protectiva was at work on Arrakis, giving Jessica a ready-made movement to back her activities should she choose to engage with it, and engage with it she did. One of her first scenes as the Lady of Arrakis shows her picking her household staff, and someone recommends she keeps the former housekeeper on for her skills. That woman? Shadout Mapes, who's described by Jessica as a knobby, gray-haired woman in a shapeless sack dress of bondsman brown. Mapes looked as wrinkled and desiccated as any member of the mob that greeted Paul and Jessica along the way from the landing field to the palace, but her manner was stiff and her aura projected strength. Soon after she presented herself to Jessica, the big scene between them takes place where Jessica manipulates Fremen belief to protect her son. She begins by calling out Mapes for carrying a concealed weapon, and then reminds her that she has nowhere to escape. After confirming that she isn't an assassin, Jessica proceeds to describe Mapes' Crysknife, and as she does so, she uses the word maker. What she was going to say was maker of death, but Mapes' fanatical beliefs made her think that Jessica was referring to the Maker, aka Shai-Hulud, aka the Great Sandworm. If she hadn't burst into tears at the feeblest mentions of her own belief system, she'd have realized that Jessica didn't have a clue about Fremen culture and religion, but by being such an ardent believer, Mapes, who is supposed to be gathering information, ends up revealing quite a bit to Jessica. After accepting the Crysknife from Mapes and drawing blood to signify its ritualistic purpose, Jessica gets her foot in with the Fremen, and from there, she's off to the races. After quote-unquote confirming that Jessica is the mother of the Savior and that Paul himself is the Mahdi, Mapes starts doing things that actively protects their lives. She's there when the hunter-seeker meant for Paul goes awry, which she interprets as her people's savior saving her life. This convinces her to give the Atreides her support, which she does by revealing the presence of a traitor within their midst, though she doesn't yet know the traitor's name. Shadout Mapes is one of the first Atreides household staff members to be killed by said traitor, who's revealed to be Dr. Wellington Yue, and that's about where her character journey begins and ends in the first book. Shadout Mapes was important because she acted as a bridge between the Atreides, specifically Paul and Jessica, and the Fremen, and she was also a great early example of the false power of prophecy. Nothing in Dune is as cut and dry as "it is written, so it shall be," yet that's the exact philosophy the Fremen approach their lives with because it's all they've ever known. Shadout Mapes' personal belief makes her cut off Jessica before she can reveal that she doesn't know much about Fremen culture, and it marks the beginning of the pollution of Fremen society at the hands of the Atreides. In many ways, Shadout is the first person to sacrifice herself for the larger ideal of finding the Mahdi, which is revealed to be false anyways, because the Mahdi is a figure the Bene Gesserit planted within their belief system. And she also reveals the true political cunning of the original House Atreides, which is explored to a certain degree by Denis Villeneuve's Dune films. Shadout Mapes was old and gray by the time the Atreides arrived on Arrakis, and so she must have known that she wouldn't live long enough to see her people freed from oppression. But she wasn't so old that she couldn't contribute towards that freedom. Her presence at the Imperial Palace helped Paul and Jessica transition into the Fremen lifestyle later on in the tale, and Shadout Mapes became an important figure in the myth about the rise of the Mahdi. But as is the case with all things Dune, once Brian Herbert got his hands on his father's intellectual property, he couldn't help but meddle with much of its pre-established lore and mechanics. The Dune fandom is divided on whether to even consider Brian and his writing partner Kevin J. Anderson's work as being canonical to Frank's original saga, because that's how far things veer off in their books. Where Frank's approach to Dune was more philosophical, exploring the impact of things like supreme oppression and supreme salvation with psychotropic drugs as the background, Brian's approach is a much more simplified and action-oriented one. Frank would spend page after page exploring a character's personal ideologies, just to demonstrate how complicated life in a multi-institutional imperium can be, but Brian's work is a lot more traditional, in the sense that it's clearly about good guys fighting bad guys. In the original Dune, the line between good and evil wasn't so clear at all, and in fact, it can be argued that Paul's entire arc was a lesson on how to become a successful tyrant. Dune ends with him assuming the Imperial throne and threatening to nuke his enemies, and Dune 2 opens with the information that Paul has killed over 60 billion people across the Imperium, thanks to his Fremen jihad. Dune was always a toss-up between good guys doing bad things and bad guys giving good speeches. It was a tale of contradictions, and Frank weaved those contradictions together in a way that they both made sense and were still quite tragic. Brian, though, prefers to punch his way out of story blocks, and that's kind of evident with the whole Edge of the Crysknife storyline. No one asked for an origin story for Shadout Mapes of all people, yet he decided to create one, probably because he knows he can't milk Paul and Jessica Atreides for any more content. You'll see what we mean by that in just a few minutes, but now that we've brought up the subject of this video, let's talk about why we're talking about all that stuff about Mapes from the original Dune novel. Edge of the Crysknife takes its entire premise from the exchange between Jessica and Mapes, and that's why we brought up its importance. During that exchange, Jessica says that she knows Mapes has borne children, lost loved ones, hidden in fear, and done violence. She knows that Mapes will do violence again because she knows many things, and it's this one throwaway statement from Jessica that forms the backbone of this whole series. So now that we've given you the context behind why these comic books exist, let's talk about what actually happens in them. Fedai Keen Shadout Mapes. Her life before becoming a caretaker. Dune, Edge of the Crysknife begins with a story titled Hiding Among Harkonnens. The first page shows us Arrakis' scorching sun, blazing orange through the sky. It appears to be getting close to sunset, but on a Harkonnen spice harvesting mine, day and night are irrelevant concepts. We see a man with a mask and desert gear drilling something as his cohorts guide chests filled with melange to their storage and delivery points. The narrator reminds us that this is a spice harvesting operation meant to siphon melange, the most important substance in the universe, off of Arrakis. We see workers carrying back-breaking loads of melange to loading docks, and we're told that the cost of working in such a mine is extremely high, both financially and on a humanitarian level, because spice mining means you're open to attack from a sandworm at any given time. This is something Villeneuve's first Dune film captured perfectly, because we saw the tremendous loss that even a single worm attack can inflict upon the entire operation. In fact, we see the leader of this particular mine checking in with his spotters for worm signs, because he knows that he only has a limited amount of time to maximize his profits before Shai Hulud shows up. What he doesn't know is that his supply is already in danger, because that's when the perspective shifts to our Fremen protagonist, and we see her looking at the Harkonnen spice mine, practically salivating with anticipation. Say hello to Fremen Fedai Keen Shadout Mapes. Before that name became synonymous with Paul Atreides' elite death commandos, the name Fedai Keen was reserved for the most elite Fremen guerrilla warriors, whose sole purpose in life was to raid the outposts of their enemies. For all of Fremen history, Those enemies were Imperial spice harvesters and governors, so it makes sense why a Fedai Keen squad has shown up at this particular spice mine. As the workers go about their busy day, Mapes' second-in-command tells her that everything looks set for their attack, and she gives them the order to execute the plan, saying that the Harkonnen blood that they spill here will, quote, enrich the sands. Brian and Kevin did a decent job of maintaining the Fremen's brutality in this scene because we're shown that Mapes and her comrades mercilessly wipe out the entire mine's workforce, despite them not being involved with the Harkonnen High Command. These guys weren't the Fremen's real oppressors, but Mapes and the Fremen don't make a distinction between ground-level miners and high-level administrators. To them, everyone who tries to steal the spice is a Harkonnen oppressor, and Mapes even kills a man whilst claiming the same to him. We find out that, contrary to the Harkonnen spotter's assessment, a worm sign has been detected, and in 7 minutes, the entire spice mine would be under attack from Shai Hulud. This is all part of Mapes' plan, though, because she knows exactly how to shut down the entire operation. As soon as her squad gets word of the worm sign, they ditch the mine and head into a mountain while calling a Harkonnen carryall for pickup. The Harkonnen miners arrive in utter confusion at the complete radio silence from the mine that has just called for them. While they try to discover what went down, Mapes' Fedai Keen pull out a rocket launcher and blow up one of the 3 carryalls that answered the call, create enough of a commotion for the sandworm to detect. As soon as Shai Hulud destroys all Harkonnen spice operations in that region, Mapes and her Fedaykin chant Bless the Maker and His Water, a sacred Fremen saying, and head back home for a victory party. It's at this point that we're introduced to Mapes' lover, Rafir. Rafir is a character we don't see in the Dune novels for reasons that should be obvious. Mapes is in her 20s during the events of Edge of the Crysknife, and she's considerably older in the first Dune novel, but Jessica did say that Mapes has lost loved ones and birthed children, so that means she must have had a lover or been married back in the day. Mapes' man is Rafir. When she reaches the Sietch, she's told that Naib wants to see her, but Mapes chooses to celebrate victory first, drinking a spice concoction with Rafir and proceeding to have psychedelic-enhanced sex with him. This entire intro sequence is meant to establish her character early on in her life. She was a fierce warrior woman who commanded immense respect from her peers and was as wise and wild as you'd expect a Fremen woman to be. She was faithful, but her faith was also centralized around the ritualistic use of the strongest drug in the universe, and having spiced up sex was quite common for the Fremen. In fact, we're kind of glad that Villeneuve didn't depict the notorious spice orgies of the Fremen in his films, because we think that might be a little bit too much for most audiences to stomach, especially with the enigmatic manner in which Villeneuve films his prophetic visions. So, that's who Mapes used to be. She wasn't a well-dipper or a homemaker. She was a killer who spilled blood on the front lines for the sake of her god, Shai Hulud. She fought and she loved and she was loyal to all those who were loyal to her. Yes, she was radicalized by the collective Fremen belief that all who tried to steal the spice were oppressors, but for the most part, she seemed to be a good woman. In fact, in comparison to her mom, Mapes felt a lot more progressive and in touch with the current state of Arrakis. After waking up from her tryst with Rafir, Mapes goes to visit the Naib as was requested of her upon her return, and we learn that the Naib is actually her mother, Safi. This is already quite a massive change from the novels, where it was established that only Fremen men become Naibs, whereas Fremen women become Sayadinas, wild reverend mothers. Safia, being both for her Sietch, shows that she went above and beyond the call of duty as a Fremen, and she has the battle scars to prove it. While Mapes' operation went off without a hitch, Safia still remembers the day she had to stop raiding because she lost her leg during a raid on the Richees. That's right, when Safia was a Fedai Keen, House Richees was still in control of Arrakis, and Mapes even points out to her mom that their current oppressors are Harkonnens, not Richeesians. Safia dismisses this correction by claiming off-worlders are off-worlders, and praises her daughter for bathing the sands with their blood, which makes sense considering how hard she had to fight for her own place among the men of her world. Safia initially became a Fedai Keen by hiding her sex from her peers, and when it was revealed that she was a woman, she challenged every man who questioned her strength to ritual combat, thus earning her station as Naib and Sayadina. It seems to us that Brian and Kevin are trying to portray Safia as the main reason that people like Chaney were allowed to become Fedai Keen in the main Dune novels, which we don't have a problem with. Mapes thinking that her mom is going senile has a bit of that young upstart feel to it as well, so we can overlook that detail too. But Safia handing Mapes her own Crysknife without engaging her in some sort of formal bloodletting ritual was when we started to think that something felt off about this story, and that's when we were hit with the main plotline. Safia wasn't praising her daughter because she saw herself in Mapes, which she probably did. She was buttering her up for her next mission. And that mission? Why, becoming a spy, of course. And this is where Mapes from these comics and Shadout Mapes from the novels start becoming closer to being the same character. the reason she became a caretaker, Mapes the spy, and her worst mistake. Mapes is told by her mother that she has done well as a Fedaykin, and she can do even more by not fighting in the light, but by lurking in the shadows. She tells Mapes that while men are stuck swinging their Crysknives around at the enemy, women can do much more because they have the power to, quote, become invisible. What she means by this is she wants Mapes to go undercover and infiltrate the Harkonnen governor's residence to find information that can rout out these oppressors as effectively as Safia herself drove off House Atreides. And we should have guessed that something would go awfully wrong with this plan when Safia told her daughter to become a spy without using the word, and she failed to understand what becoming invisible meant. Safia did her best to explain espionage to Mapes and then put on her fake leg with her daughter's leg to inform her siege of their plan. The reason she did this was so she could mobilize every Fremen in the Harkonnen capital of Carthage, which is where Mapes was instructed to go to. At first, Mapes finds it difficult to get herself into the governor's inner circle. She finds out that Dmitri Harkonnen, who is the father of Vladimir Harkonnen and grandfather of Fade Rautha, is as brutal a man as he is cautious. Through her conversations with other staff members, Mapes soon realizes that without bribing the current head of the household, she had no hopes of getting into the governor's office. Yes, she understands her mother's comments about invisibility a lot more when she sees that a simple outfit swap makes the Harkonnen men blind to her true nature, but she doesn't understand the concept of invisibility itself. Mapes' job was to infiltrate, gather intel, and leave Carthage without raising too much suspicion. She wasn't explicitly instructed not to kill anyone, but that would have been implied because killings are usually the reason spies get exposed. Mapes was supposed to not be seen or heard, and her actions should have had negligible to no impact on the Harkonnen household overall. But she was a warrior. First instinct was always to reach for her blade. She ends up murdering the current head of the Harkonnen household and replaces her as Dmitri Harkonnen's new personal housekeeper, but that was her first mistake. Mapes started snooping around Dmitri's office the first chance she got, and because she was new to espionage, she probably didn't realize that all of Dmitri's soldiers were feeding her information the governor wanted her to know. It's rather telling that there's a whole panel where a Harkonnen soldier tosses something at Mapes' head, and she laughs internally, thinking that they don't know who or what she is, when in reality, they know exactly what she's up to. After she gathers intel about a massive spice shipment and its location, Mapes promptly returns to her siege, shares her intel so they can form a Fedaykin squad for a raid, and sleeps with her lover, this time conceiving his child as well. She tells him as much right before they launch into this all-important raid that could change the fate of their people, and Rafir promises to marry her after they return. But alas, that day never comes. The Fremen attack goes off smoothly at first, with Fedaykin clearing Harkonnen soldiers from the working areas who for some reason are only using stunners. It's when the Fremen start planting charges and working their way towards the spice silos that they realize they've been suckered into a trap. Harkonnen soldiers begin slaughtering every Fedaykin they can find, and Mapes, who's in an aircraft waiting to evacuate her people, is forced to fly away without them. It's Rafir who tells her to go because he knows that with this many Harkonnen surrounding them, nothing can be done. Mapes returns to the siege with news of her loss, but she remains determined to rescue her lover and the father of her child. She tries to beg her mother for a rescue team during a siege communion, but is either rejected by those angry over the loss of their loved ones, those who wouldn't risk more lives to save that of a few, and those who would rather use subterfuge than be caught out in the open, including her mom. Mapes goes back to Carthage with her housekeeper disguise and somehow manages to trick every single prison guard into thinking that the Harkonnen governor has word for his Fremen hostages. I mean, just that one sentence should reveal the idiocy of this plan to you, because in the Dune novels, Harkonnens bred their hatred for the Fremen into their soldiers, but we guess the comic's point is to show just how much worse they themselves can be. When Mapes brings up the governor's name and asks the guards to check with him, they just let her in because they'd rather not face the fury of House Harkonnen. But that still doesn't make the scene where Mapes reunites with Rafir make any sense, because she literally enters a cell made out of laser walls and starts just openly discussing options to facilitate Rafir and her comrades' escape. Rafir dissuades her by reminding her that she has more than one life in her hands now, and an escape would be impossible because the Harkonnens beefed up security. He makes Mapes promise that she won't do anything stupid like leading a one-woman rescue attempt where she tries snatching Rafir off the executioner's block. Mapes promises that she won't, fully intending to betray his trust and see him one last time, but when it's revealed that Dmitri Harkonnen will kill these desert terrorists by painting their skin with corrosive acid until all its layers dissolve, the horror becomes too much for her and she decides to take her leave. The next time we see Mapes is in Edge of the Crysknife, Rage of Shai-Hulud, and quite a few years have passed since then. She's given birth to Rafir's son, who's already come of age and bears the Fremen name Samos. Rage of Shai-Hulud opens with Mapes training Samos to become a Fedaykin, and though it's clear that she has far more experience than him, Samos is no innocent bystander. He constantly outmaneuvers his mom, and even when his grandma distracts him by throwing her prosthetic leg at him, Samos still manages to nick Mapes, which brings their first blood duel to a rather stagnant end. Both mother and son draw each other's blood at roughly the same time, so Mapes is proud of her boy and eager to ride to war with him. But immediately after this training sequence, we see Samos returning from a successful raid, which he describes as a complete victory, but isn't. Samos's raid killed 6 Harkonnen soldiers, but lost 2 Fremen Fedaykin as well. When his mom presses him to repeat his claims at those Fremen's funeral, he admits that his victory wasn't complete. After this incident, Safia brings up the power of invisibility once more and sends her daughter back to the governor's palace to infiltrate and spy. During this time skip, Dmitri Harkonnen was assassinated on their homeworld Gedi Prime, so a new Harkonnen governor had been assigned to Arrakis. His name was Abulurd, and he wasn't nearly as efficient as his predecessor, which Mapes discovers rather quickly. In her first day as Abulurd's housekeeper, she realizes that accessing him is a lot easier than it was to get even 10 feet close to Dmitri, and she exploits this weakness in Abulurd to quickly further the Fremen cause. She manipulates his shipping manifest to make it look like a vital shipment of supplies from Gedi Prime was going to arrive a day later, while sending the shipment's drop location to her siege so her people could feast on Harkonnen supplies for a while. This incident leads to a 7-year stretch where Fremen raids on Harkonnen supplies and spice mines became bolder and bolder, thanks to Mapes' insider intel. She's learned how to pull it back, and she mostly observes her Harkonnen oppressors in silence now, and her information has helped her people secure a string of crucial victories. But the Fremen war against their oppressors is never ending, because they might win these smaller battles, but they keep losing the war for freedom. At a siege council, Mapes' son Samos proposes a bold plan to draw out Emperor Elrud himself by attacking the Orgiz spice mine. It was one of the biggest sites of Harkonnen spice production on the planet, and Samos had a plan that would have worked if everything went perfectly. He was going to use a sandworm as a rider to infiltrate the walls protecting Orgiz's location, and then allow Shai Hulud to take care of their enemies. Orgiz formed a third of all Harkonnen revenue, so losing it would be a crippling blow to their operations and force the Emperor to reconsider Fremen freedom. This was the thought process behind Mapes, Safia, and Samos' decision to attack Orgiz, but the raid itself ended in disaster. After Shai Hulud entered the mine's walls, the Fedaykin started slaughtering any guards or soldiers they could find. In response, the Harkonnens activated their shields, which horrified Mapes because she knew what was coming after that. Sure enough, the sandworm Samos was riding starts going berserk and knocks its rider off its back to his death. It also destroys Orgiz in its entirety, with Mapes being the sole survivor. This is the moment where Mapes realizes that violence only begets violence and doesn't really solve anything, because Operation Orgiz fulfills its objectives and still fails to complete the actual mission. Abulurd Harkonnen's incompetency sees him being recalled from Arrakis, and Mapes knows that she should be celebrating this, but somehow she feels empty and empathetic towards Abulurd because after losing Samos, she's come to somewhat understand the futility of a perpetual war. Her mother's entire modus operandi depended upon who the next person Emperor Elrud sent to Arrakis would be, because she was just hoping that this guy would be better than Dmitri and Abulurd. If Safia wasn't so swept up in her own glory, she might have realized that Abulurd was actually her only hope of reconciling the Fremen with the Imperium, because his successor would turn out to be the worst Fremen oppressor in their millennia-long history. As Abulurd's Highliner departs Arrakis, Mapes notes that his successor specifically times his arrival to avoid showing his face to Abulurd. And then, we see a young Baron Vladimir Harkonnen descend from the Highliner as he gleefully introduces himself and claims the Fremen as his. That's how Edge of a Crysknife, Rage of Shai Hulud ends, which highlights the inherent problem we have with these two comics. The overarching plot narrative of violence begetting violence is threaded between them seamlessly, because even Mapes starts questioning the value of violence if it can never cause a real change. Towards the end of the story, she starts feeling sorry for robbing Abulurd of his command, and perhaps she even thinks that they could have worked together in some capacity, and he says he was honored to have served Arrakis in his farewell address. While Abulurd seemed to be a trusting and genuine man, the Fremen bias against off-worlders got him exiled to Lankyvale, where he spent the rest of his life in obscurity, and Mapes realizes too late that maybe taking the fight to the Harkonnens was a bad idea. Abulurd gets replaced by a man who's even worse than Dmitri Harkonnen ever was, and we don't have to get too deep into those details, because you guys have seen what Vlad is all about thrice over now. Being a warrior is great, but knowing when to sue for peace is one of the fundamental aspects of war that people don't like talking about. Peace deals represent compromise, an agreement that's signed by both sides mutually, and such peace can't exist on a world that views all outsiders as enemies. Yet, For peace, signing a treaty with outsiders is crucial because it's clear that Arrakis and spice harvesting aren't going anywhere. Mapes thinking that Abulurd was a broken man like her feels like an offhanded comment about them both losing family members, but we think it represents the shattering of their self-identity because both Abulurd and Mapes change after this. Mapes goes on to continue being a Shadout for the Imperial Palace, now located in Arrakis, and Abulurd, as we mentioned, is all but forgotten by history. On the surface level, Dune, Edge of a Crysknife, does a great job of depicting how Fremen were part of the problem of oppression because at no point do they even consider diplomacy as being a viable option. But when you zoom into the story, many of its minor details are so inconsistent with established lore that you end up not wanting to read ahead regardless of the decent little narrative. For instance, when Samos attacks Orgiz, he has to drive the sandworm through a shield wall to reach the mine, yet for some reason, it's only the shields that the miners activate that gives him trouble while he's riding the sandworm. Mapes' mom just giving her a Crysknife like a family heirloom really undermines the symbolic importance of that blade in Fremen society, because whenever a Crysknife is unsheathed, it can't be put back into the sheath without drawing blood. Abulurd Harkonnen being on Arrakis in the first place is a continuity error, because in Frank's original work, he's Vladimir Harkonnen's half-brother and he's shipped off to Lankyvale a long time before Vlad officially becomes the Baron of Arrakis. And finally, the only thing that is canonically consistent about these comics is Vladimir Harkonnen himself, because his one-page appearance perfectly encapsulates his nature as a beast in human skin. So if you guys love Shadout Mapes and are hungry for some graphic Dune content, we'd suggest you give Edge of a Crysknife a try because honestly, it's quite a pleasant read. But if you care about the canon and the intricacies of Frank's original novels, then this video should tell you everything you need to know about how the Fremen themselves brought Vladimir Harkonnen down on their own heads. If they'd played their cards right, they could have been stuck with the incompetent yet pliable Abulurd for years, and their people wouldn't have suffered as badly as they did under the Baron. But alas, that's the thing about retrospect. It only works because neither you nor I can change the past. Marvelous verdict! But as for the present, that's all we got for you guys, so let us know your thoughts down in the comments section below. While you're down there, if you enjoyed this video, consider liking and subscribing to Marvelous Videos if you want more deep dives into affiliated Dune content like this, because it might not be entirely canon, but it does allow us to keep revisiting this masterpiece of a science fiction world. As always, stay safe out there, and we'll see you guys again real soon.